Okay, today we're going to take a look at the integration between ServiceTrade and Intacct. The integration covers a few different areas, primarily items, customers or companies, locations and contacts, and jobs and invoices. And then the last thing we'll look at the very end is job attachments. So to start with, we're going to start by creating a demo company and a location. And then we'll kind of walk through creating a job and then invoicing the job, and then we'll test the attachment piece at the very end. Now, the integration is constantly running in the background, and it's looking at these different objects that I mentioned to monitor for new records or changes to ones that have been mapped between the system. And we're also going to be looking at just kind of the standard field mappings. Pretty much any field mapping can be added or slightly changed depending on if you have unique needs, as long as the ServiceTrade and Intacct API supports that functionality, which it typically does. So even though you might see a certain field mapped or not mapped here, it doesn't mean that it can't be done that way. What we found is pretty much all of our customers have some variation in how they like those things mapped. So there's always a little bit of adjustment to kind of what's the standard, if you will. So let's start by creating a customer company to work with. And as I go through this, there's going to be times when I'm typing and kind of quiet. So let me work through those. All right, so we have a customer. At this point, the integration is looking in the background. It's going to see this new customer was created, and it's going to create a customer in Intacct. While we're waiting on that, let's just go ahead and add a location as well. Okay. And for this, I'm going to just select all the service lines. You have to select one. I'm just selecting all of them. Okay, so now we have a location. So within the next 10, 20 seconds or so, depending on when we timed it, the integration should see these changes and bring them over to Intacct. So let's go and find our customer. And here that is, LBMC Demo Company. So a couple things to note here. Intacct is auto-generating the customer ID in this case. Doesn't have to be that way, but that's how we have it in this demo. So it assigned the number C13. And then if we look at the contact list, yeah, it looks like our location made it over. So here's the LBMC Demo Brentwood. And it gave this contact name. This number at the end is a number from ServiceTrade. It's used to kind of uniquely identify these contacts on the Intacct side. The other thing you'll notice in ServiceTrade is, let's look at the company record. We're leveraging the external system to show the customer ID that was passed back from Intacct. So here's that C13 that we just saw. So that's how the link is established between those two. And you'll see the same thing at the location. So here's the full sort of key, if you will, that links this location to its corresponding contact on the Intacct side. Okay, so that's basic customer and location. Of course, we can add as many locations as we want. As we do that, they're going to add to this contact list in Intacct for that customer. So each location becomes a sort of a child contact of the customer record. The next thing we want to look at is creating a job. So let's, using our demo location here that we just created, let's go ahead and add a job. And I'm just going to choose basic things here. We'll create the job. Now we need to add a line item for this job, so let's do that. I'll talk about items a little bit later. There's a lot of configuration that goes into these items, but we'll come back around and talk about those in a minute. So we'll just add the one line item. And now that we have our job kind of set up, we will go ahead and mark it complete. So let's do a couple of things in this step. We'll complete the job, and then we'll go straight into creating an invoice. All right, so let's say we had one of these. That looks okay, so let's create the invoice. All right, we're going to come back to this invoice. Before I save it and before we move it to the next step, let's just look at what happened with the job. So the job that we created came over to Intacct as a project. And the job number you can see for customer C13 here. This is the job that we were working with. This number, the ID, and the name, that is the job number from ServiceTrade. This is just the standard mapping. We can make the project ID and the project name pretty much anything you want. A lot of times people will use the same number like we have here for the project ID, but maybe for the name, they'll use some combination of fields, like maybe the project ID plus maybe the name of the location that it occurred at. Others I've seen use kind of more complex rules to determine that name. So there's a lot of flexibility that we can provide in terms of how these things are named. I just want to point that out, that these numbers are just sort of the basics of what comes from ServiceTrade, but is definitely not, not usually, certainly when it comes to the names, not usually the value that ends up being the case with most of our customers. They've got some other naming convention that they want implemented, which we can support. So we've got our project here. Let's just take a look at some of the things that came over. Of course, it's attached to the demo company that we created. And the other basics that come over are the ship to contact. This is the location, if you remember, that this project is assigned to. This same contact and location, if you will, can be set to the primary bill to contact and ship to contact. There's a lot of possibilities there. We've got customers that just leave it like this. We've got some that use it as the bill to and the ship to. We've got some that do some more sophisticated things. So there's a lot of different options in terms of how these are used. But really what we want to highlight here is the fact that, the contact, at least in this case, the ship to contact, is related to the location that job was created for. Most of these other fields can be set through the integration. They tend to be dependent on what the customer needs, what the client needs in terms of how they want those fields mapped. So things like project manager, for example, could even be set up, or maybe we use the Intacct employee dimension that requires that the employees exist in ServiceTrade, or that we have a way to look them up between ServiceTrade and Intacct so that we can set that. We do have some customers that use that. It's a little bit more advanced, but it's possible. So this is the basics for a project, just so that we have the project record here. And the next thing we want to do is look at our invoice. So we kind of left off here. We haven't yet sent this invoice. So I'm just going to make some notes. And then we'll take the invoice as it is, save it. Now let's notice a couple things here. The invoice number, this is the number that ServiceTrade is assigned right now. After we send it to Intacct, Intacct is going to assign an invoice number and pass it back to ServiceTrade, and it'll overwrite this number here. We'll look at that in just a second. Now the way to, once you're ready and you're ready to send this invoice to Intacct, the way that's done is going to the Actions menu and just click Mark as Sent. And that's going to put this invoice in the sent status, as you see here. And at this point, the standard logic for the integration is that when it detects an invoice transitioning to the sent status, it's going to attempt to pick that invoice up and create a corresponding order entry transaction on the Intacct side. Now we use, in this demo, we're using a specific type of order entry transaction we've created called ServiceTrade Invoice. So let's take a look. All right, so there it is. So there's our demo company, number 00179. Before we look at the invoice there, let's just refresh this page. And you'll see that now that invoice number changed to this, and this is the actual ID of that invoice within Intacct. All right, so let's go back to Intacct and just look at some of the things that were sent over real quick. Okay, so the customer, bill to and ship to, or the location. Here's the reference to the project or the job that that invoice pertains to. Here's the number that was assigned. Some of these other things come from, here's the demo notes, the notes field that I typed in earlier on the invoice. We do still have the invoice ID from ServiceTrade. Its original ID is passed over here just so we can keep track of that if we need it. And then, of course, in this case, we only have the one line item that was added. So the next thing to do is, this is in a draft status right now. So let's post this invoice. And that's going to close it out. And then the integration is going to see that that invoice state in Intacct changed. And it should update the status of this invoice in ServiceTrade once it's processed. So let's give it a couple seconds and we'll refresh the page and take a look at it. Just take note that right now, status is pending accounting. This means it's been sent to Intacct. Let's refresh and see if it's updated. Okay, so now the status is processed. And that's basically closing out the invoice. Okay. All right, the last thing we want to look at is attachments. So let's go back to our job that we were working with earlier. And let's add an attachment to this job. This one may take a few seconds longer to run because there's some other things happening in the background. While we're waiting on that, we'll describe a couple of things about attachments. Attachments only flow from the ServiceTrade job to the Intacct project. If you delete an attachment here, like if I were to delete this in ServiceTrade, the integration cannot delete it for you in Intacct. You have to manually delete that if that's important to you. Furthermore, if you were to somehow update or edit this attachment, change it in some way, the integration can't change that in Intacct as well. It has to do with kind of the differences about how Intacct manages attachments versus all the other data we looked at so far. So we're a little bit limited in comparison in terms of attachments and what we can do. It's basically just if you create them or upload them here in ServiceTrade, we can send them to Intacct and they should appear there. But that's about the extent of it. So there's no data flowing back from attachments, or we can't track changes of documents or anything like that. Some customers use this attachment feature, some don't. That's something that could be enabled or disabled just based on your needs. We're just kind of showing it here for completeness. So let's go back and see if it's appeared on our project yet. This was the project we were working with. Yeah, okay. So now, you see our attachment here. And if I open this up, hopefully you can see it's just a test PDF document I use. So that's attachments flowing back. And the last thing I want to talk about is items. We can support items being mastered in either ServiceTrade or Intacct. In most cases, in fact, probably almost all cases, customers choose to master their items in Intacct. And one of the biggest reasons for that has to do with sales tax, how that's calculated. If you choose, so I'm going to talk about items being mastered in Intacct because that's the most common scenario. Assuming you're doing that, then you can leverage things like Avalara or any other way that you're calculating tax on the Intacct side for items. And you don't have to worry about that on the ServiceTrade side. The Intacct invoice, when you send it over, will automatically calculate the appropriate tax. So assuming items are being mastered here in Intacct, that just means that anytime you add an item, and these are some that I've added here, if you notice, we'll look at this one. This is the alarm service demo item that I created. And basically, we give it an ID and a name and a cost and a base price, and that information gets sent over to ServiceTrade, and that item becomes available in ServiceTrade. So we'll just look at that. So here's that item that I synced earlier. Now, there's some other setup that goes into items, and it's part of the reason I didn't demonstrate creating a new item here. There's some other setup that goes into items, and particularly on the Intacct side, and how they work with the transaction definition for your order entry transaction. So earlier we were looking at these ServiceTrade invoices. You can set up these transaction definitions to look at the type of item, to maybe look at the ID of the item and determine, and its GL group, and determine how that revenue, let's say for a given item on an invoice, how it's posted to the GL. So there's a little bit more setup that happens with those items that's usually either already done when we set up the integration, or it's part of maybe a broader Intacct implementation. So that takes a little bit more time to walk through and kind of gets us into connecting to the GL and some stuff like that that the integration doesn't directly do. So we're just kind of describing that. But the key takeaways here are typically people master their items in Intacct, which means they always create new items in Intacct, and those items are sent to ServiceTrade so that they're available to put on jobs. You can master items in ServiceTrade and send them to Intacct. Typically that will bring up some questions around how you're going to handle sales tax calculation. So we don't see that very often, but from an integration point of view, it is supported. But we do recommend that you choose one system to master those items in, which means you only have one system you always create or update items in, and the integration is configured to pass it to the other system, sync those changes to the other system as needed. So that was a quick run through of all the different key integration points between ServiceTrade and Intacct for the basic integration. Another thing I just want to repeat is that, you know, a lot of the things that we saw in terms of how fields were mapped, particularly when we're talking about projects and the name of the project, those things can be changed. And usually in our implementation time, we allow a little bit of buffer to make some changes to the field mappings within reason, to make some things that are a little bit more specific to either your naming conventions or specific fields you want to have mapped. And then, of course, if you've got more complex business process kind of needs that the integration doesn't do out of the box, we can typically support those as well. But those things need to be sort of defined up front to understand what the effort's going to be to implement them. So we've done a wide variety of those types of customizations. So that's really just a matter of kind of talking through any additional needs you might need there. So I'm going to stop here, and that's it.